I'm going to commit a cardinal Need for Speed sin and tell you something that you might get mad at me for. When I was a kid and Need for Speed Most Wanted first came out, I wasn't a big fan of the game. Now, hear me out. After recently replaying it, I feel differently, and we'll get into that another time. So when it comes to Need for Speed Carbon, back in 2006 when it first got put onto shelves, I actually opted out of the game and didn't play it at all. I know all of this is information overload and you're ready to drop a dislike, tell me off in the comments, and click off the video. But before you do, hear me out. I finally played Need for Speed Carbon today for the very first time, 18 years later, and I can honestly say it's a great title, but I do have some mixed feelings about it that we'll get into soon enough. For me, I always gravitated into the underground games, as they just seemed to resonate with me more as a kid and what my interests were and what kind of cars I liked. I was into the early Fast and Furious movies before the franchise became about going to space and saving the world and all that shit. So what I instantly noticed about Need for Speed Carbon was that it felt like the love child between Need for Speed Most Wanted mixed with the underground games, with a hint of Fast and Furious Tokyo Drift, topped with a sprinkle of its own sauce, the carbon sauce. What is the carbon sauce, you might ask yourself? Well, it's the vibe. It's dark, it's mysterious, it's ambient with a killer soundtrack. That's the carbon sauce. One thing that really stood out to me was the atmosphere of this game. Carbon oozes this dark, almost underground vibe, but it's not quite as flashy as underground. It's more ominous. The city of Palmont feels like it has secrets. It's got this shadowy, mysterious tone that pulls you in. Even the soundtrack complements that feeling. It's ambient, brooding, and layered with tension, making you feel like you're racing for something bigger than just a virtual trophy.
You're done, punk.
And that's what I like to call the carbon sauce. It's this unique blend of dark aesthetics and suspenseful energy that keeps you on the edge while racing through the city. Palmont isn't just a backdrop, it's a character and it's moody. Nighttime setting is a huge part of this game's identity. You feel like you're racing through the shadows almost. Now, one of the biggest changes Carbon brought to the table was the introduction of crews. You're not just a lone racer anymore, you build a team. Each member plays a specific role. You've got blockers, drafters, and scouts. At first, I thought this was just a gimmick, but after playing with it, I realized it added a layer of strategy to the races. A little bit.
Alright, let me know when you want me to block level.
Hey, come on, that's not fair.
That's it.
The blocker is basically your enforcer. They'll take out rival cars for you. It's a nice touch, especially during the more chaotic moments when you're trying to focus on the road and someone's tailing you too close. It's a bit like having a personal bodyguard on the track. The drafter, this one's a bit tricky. On paper, it sounds awesome. They create a slipstream and you draft behind them for a speed boost, and it also helps you corner because it kind of sucks you in this weird vortex thing. But in practice, it feels a bit awkward. When you're locked into the drafting animation, you lose some control of your car, and if you're not careful, you could end up crashing when you exit the draft. It's a mechanic in this game that doesn't quite live up to its potential. And then there's the scout, who's supposed to find shortcuts for you during races. Now, I love shortcuts in racing games. They're game changers when done right, but in Carbon, the scouts just felt underwhelming. Most of the time, the shortcuts they lead you to aren't even that hard to find on your own. I feel like Blocker is kind of the only useful crew member. Alright, it's time. Let's talk about the real heart of Carbon, the canyon races. These races are insane. Imagine tearing down narrow, cliffside roads with sheer drops just inches away from your tires. One wrong move and you're done. No safety nets, no second chances. You're crashing off that bitch. The first time I did a canyon race, I was legit blown away. The stakes felt real. You're constantly on edge, fighting to stay on the road, and all the while, the game is throwing these ridiculous curves at you. Plus, the soundtrack ramps up the tension. It's like you're living in an action movie, specifically Tokyo Drift. And hey, Tokyo Drift came out just a few months before Carbon, so I wouldn't be surprised if the devs took some inspiration from that. Now, as much as I love the atmosphere and the racing, I can't say the same about the story and characters. Don't get me wrong, Neville's a fun sidekick. He adds some much needed comic relief. And Nikki, well, she's pretty damn hot, I gotta say. But beyond those two, the characters don't really leave much of a mark. Even Darius, the main villain, feels a bit generic, especially when you're considering the previous game's villain, Razor, who was so much more iconic. Compared to Razor, Darius is kind of a letdown. You know, Razor had that edge to him, that personality that made you want to take him down. He was such a douche. And don't get me wrong, Darius is a douche too, but isn't Razor douche? Yeah, sure. Darius, he's just there, kind of. The game tries to build him up as this big bad villain, but his trash talk doesn't hit hard, and he never really gets under your skin or does anything that proves he's a scumbag.
You actually thought that I would front you the cash to save you from this loser? Then sit around while you were encroaching on my territory? Greed's always been your problem. You've got a lot to learn about the big times, little man. This city is mine, and it's time for you to disappear again.
That being said, the final canyon race against Darius is a beast. It's not easy. I can't even tell you how many times I had to retry it. It's low-key embarrassing. But finally beating him after all those failed attempts, that was one of the most satisfying moments I've had in a racing game. The challenge was real, and for that final race alone, Carbon earns its place as one of the more memorable Need for Speed games. It tests your skills, your patience, and it doesn't let up. I was legit kind of raging, and I can't even remember the last time a game... Okay, no, not that kind of rage, it's different this time. But here's the thing, Carbon isn't perfect, far from it. For starters, the story, it's kind of all over the place. Why are we starting from scratch if we're already an established racer in Palmont City? And the whole money thing that the whole plot is based off of, that cutscene where you escape with the money, I don't know, it kind of never made sense to me. The motion blur in this game can also get pretty overwhelming. There are moments where the screen just feels too chaotic, and it really takes away from the overall experience in my opinion. It's like someone turned the motion blur up to 11 when it didn't need to be there at all, to be honest. And those territory defense races, they're a grind. It almost feels like artificial gameplay padding time in a way. You spend all this time building up your turf, and then some rival crew challenges you, forcing you to defend it constantly by replaying a race that you've already done. It breaks up the flow of the game in a way that feels more annoying than challenging in my opinion. And don't get me started about the cops. In Most Wanted, the police chases were some of the best parts of the game. Hell, I'd even say Most Wanted's police pursuit system is the best in any racing game ever made. But in Carbon, they feel like an afterthought. It's the same cop system from Most Wanted in terms of all the heat levels are the same with the differing cars, just like in Most Wanted. Just everything is toned down. The intensity is just not there. Sometimes I found myself wondering if the game even needed cops at all. So here we are, nearly 2 decades later, reflecting on Need for Speed Carbon, a game that, for many, falls in the shadow of its more iconic predecessors, like Most Wanted and the Underground games. But even though it doesn't often get the same recognition, Carbon has quietly carved out its own legacy in the Need for Speed universe. It's a game that represents a bridge between eras, blending the street racing roots of the Underground series with the police chases and tension of Most Wanted. At its core, Carbon felt like a game that was trying to evolve Need for Speed into something more than just a racer. The addition of crew mechanics and territory control suggested a shift towards strategy, giving players the feeling that they were building something more permanent than just a reputation. It was about owning the streets, controlling the city, and racing for dominance. Even if the crew system didn't always work as well as it could have, it was an ambitious step forward. In many ways, it laid the groundwork for future racing games that embraced more team-based dynamics. And then there were the canyon races, easily Carbon's standout feature. No other Need for Speed game, not before or since, has captured that sheer sense of danger and excitement like the canyon duels did. It was more than just a race, it was survival. The thrill of navigating those perilous cliffs at breakneck speeds while a pounding soundtrack heightened every moment, that's something Carbon gave us that still holds up today. It's interesting, looking back, how much Carbon was inspired by the times. Tokyo Drift had just hit theaters, the street racing scene was still hot, and the influence is all over Carbon. The game leans heavily into that culture, especially with its visual style, car customization, and the emphasis on drifting. You can tell the developers were trying to tap into that fast-paced, neon-lit aesthetic that was captivating car enthusiasts and moviegoers alike. But what's fascinating about Carbon is that despite its attempt to push boundaries, it's often seen as a transitional game. It was the last Need for Speed title on the 6th generation consoles, PlayStation 2, Xbox, and GameCube, while also being on early release for the newer hardware. And that's part of why it feels both innovative and restrained. It had big ideas, but maybe not the full horsepower to fully realize them. The story felt thin, the cops were underused, and the game was shorter than the fans expected. But even with these shortcomings, it's a game that still managed to stand out in a series known for reinventing itself. When you think about Need for Speed as a whole, it's always been about evolution. From the hyper-realism of Hot Pursuit to the underground street racing of the early 2000s, this franchise has constantly adapted to changing trends and player expectations. And Carbon, it was a product of its time, but it also helped push the series forward, laying the groundwork for the next wave of Need for Speed games. It introduced elements that we take for granted now, like more intricate narrative structures, team-based racing, and an emphasis on atmosphere. In fact, many of the ideas that started in Carbon, like building a crew or racing for territory, can be seen influencing later racing games, even beyond the Need for Speed franchise. It may not be remembered as the best in the series, but Carbon undoubtedly shaped the direction of racing games to come. Looking back, Need for Speed Carbon feels like an underappreciated gem. It's not the game that everyone immediately thinks of when they talk about the series, but for those who gave it a chance, there's something special there. It captured a moment of time, a blend of street racing culture, adrenaline-pumping canyon duels, and a moody atmosphere that left a lasting impression. It wasn't perfect, but maybe that's what makes it interesting to reflect on today. Carbon was ambitious, it dared to take risks and try new things, even if all of them didn't stick. Today, I think it's a game worth revisiting, not just to relive some nostalgic moments, but to see how it fits into the larger puzzle of the Need for Speed franchise. It's a game that has aged in some surprising ways, and while it may not be the perfect masterpiece, it's a reminder that even transitional games can leave a lasting impact on the genre. Need for Speed Carbon may have come and gone, but its legacy, that still lives on. So there you have it, folks. Need for Speed Carbon, a flawed but fascinating chapter in one of the greatest racing franchises ever. Thanks for sticking with me on this one. Be sure to let me know in the comments of what you thought about Carbon, and if there's any other Need for Speed games or any other game in general you want me to revisit. Until next time, keep racing.